Thank you very much to Maxon for having me out. I am from Dallas, Texas, in the United States. So this is the first time I've ever been to Amsterdam. I had a chance to present on Friday, and then the last 2 days I've been a tourist. So we've had a lot of fun looking around the city. It's a very beautiful city, and it's also my first time actually being outside of the US. So thank you very much for having me, and thanks to Maxon for that opportunity. So I am the owner and founding artist of a studio called Already Been Chewed. Our website is www.alreadybeenchewed.tv. And you may be asking yourself, what's up with the name Already Been Chewed, or what does it mean? Or maybe you think it sounds disgusting. So what we're going to do is kind of talk through that for a moment. And essentially, the name Already Been Chewed comes from the idea that we talk with our clients and we look at their industry, and then we ask the question, okay, what's already been done? Because we want to come up with a new and a unique solution for helping you to launch your product or build your brand. And so the name Already Been Done is not quite as not as memorable. Already Been Chewed typically gets some sort of reaction out of people in some way, shape, or form. So if you would like to follow us on Instagram, we are very active on Instagram. If you have any questions about this presentation or anything else, feel free to DM us on Instagram. It's either at Already Been Chewed, or my personal account is at Barton Damer. So feel free to, again, direct message me on Instagram, and I'll do my best to make sure that I respond to any questions that you may have regarding this or anything else about the motion graphics industry. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how our studio is using Cinema 4D to help build brands and launch products through design, motion graphics, and 3D animation. Here's a little bit about our studio and our team here. Shout out to Donnie and Jordan, who we were unable to get photos of. We were actually slammed with deadlines right up until the moment getting on the plane, and a lot of our guys are still back at the US cranking on projects right now as we speak. So those two guys didn't make it in the photo, so I wanted to make sure I mentioned them. You'll notice our workspace. Our workspace is an old building, historical building that was built in the late 1800s. We bought and renovated it about 2.5 years ago or so. And one thing that we really wanted to do is have a very creative space, almost like you might see in a painting gallery where you look into the windows and painters are painting on canvases. For us, we're doing the same thing. We just happen to be painting on digital canvases. So it's a nice space to be in. If we end up having to be there late at night, waiting on renders or things like that, we've got a space where we feel like we're kind of hanging out in a fun environment and not just kind of like corporate carpet and cubicles everywhere. So that's a little bit about our space and our team. What I'd like to do now is show you our motion graphics reel. And if you're not familiar with the motion graphics reel, it's essentially about a 1.5-minute edit of a variety of different projects that we've worked on across multiple industries. So let's check that out, and then we will talk a little bit further about our process. So you can see in our motion graphics reel that we are using Cinema 4D in all of these projects, and Cinema 4D has been our, I guess, weapon of choice to be able to help brands launch products, again, across multiple industries. And so what we're going to do today is break down a particular project. And so Casio G-Shock is a watch company, and they originally released the 9600 watch in 1996. And they came to us a little over 20 years later to re-release the watch. And so our job was to develop a campaign around the re-release of this watch, again, that originally released in the 90s. Now, if you're not familiar with G-Shock, they have a very targeted environment, urban environment, and hip hop is a big part of that culture. So as we were looking at concepts for this, we wanted to make sure to include kind of like a 1990s hip hop vibe, and for me that meant East Coast hip hop in New York City because I grew up on the East Coast of the United States, and so. A big part of this was using a music track that was inspired by 90s hip hop, as well as creating and recreating New York City environments that also had graffiti elements and things like that that might feel like it was part of that era. So let's watch the spot, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the concept itself and how we used Cinema 4D to create it. So this was a very fun project for us because the client essentially came to us, told us a few of the features about the watch and things they wanted to highlight, and then allowed us to develop the creative around the re-release of this watch. So some of the things that we needed to show off about this watch was the durability. So we incorporated into the concept the like smashing through the ground to show durability. We also needed to show off that it was water resistant. And so as it smashed through the ground, you saw what seemed like interior sprinklers and fire alarms that went off and kind of created a water effect showing the water resistance of it. And so as we're working with a client like this, a lot of times what we do is we start developing the concept, and once we get kind of like a written form and inspiration and mood board signed off of, then we might begin with the very first concept board itself. What we call a concept board is essentially the look of the spot. This will give us kind of approval on style, lighting, mood, direction, and things like that. So we'll go ahead and we'll jump into it after getting kind of like a written approval and mood board approval. We'll create the very first fully 3D rendered image, and then we'll get sign off on that. And a lot of times these brands will use this as their campaign hero image, and so it might be used for billboards, print campaigns, digital assets, things where it doesn't necessarily require animation. And so this would end up being the campaign hero image. And once we get sign off and approval on this, it's going to decide a lot of other factors for us that we can kind of build off of this theme as we go and create the other worlds. So as we saw in the spot, it was a completely seamless spot, and part of the reason for that was two reasons. One, we really liked the idea of things basically coming back around again, things go out of style, they come back in style. And so here we have this classic watch from the 90s being re-released. And so we wanted to create this spot with absolutely no camera cuts whatsoever, so that we could communicate kind of like a seamless flow of things. And so when we started the watch, you may have noticed the watch was horizontal on the ground was already cracked, and then as we came all the way back around, we revealed that the watch was now up in place, creating almost like a loop, like, okay, this has happened again, and it's probably going to happen one more time. And then, of course, the idea of a clock, and that a clock goes around and comes back. So that was all part of the process. So as we were developing this concept, we got sign-off on the way it looked, and then one thing that the client brought up is that we needed to make sure that the spot also showed off, elements of the watch itself as far as the design goes. So we started looking at the watch and looking at different photos of subways and metros and things like that. And so you can see some of the inspiration. We found this just kind of photo here, and we started noticing similarities. Obviously, I've drawn in like pink arrows here, some of the inspiration behind the design. So in the spot, we began and we zoomed into the tunnel, or excuse me, we zoomed into the face of the watch, which represented the two tunnels, and then we followed the subway through. And so that was one of the ways we were reinforcing some of the designs behind the watch and the connection to the city vibe that we were creating there. And so it's really important in order to keep that flow to start figuring out, okay, how are we going to keep this seamless without camera cuts? One thing we don't want to do is we don't want to have the camera kind of like zoom in and get like a nice beauty shot of the watch and then zoom back out, because it'd be a lot of zigzags. And so we started mapping out basically like the entire world that these things were in. And so that as it went behind a stairwell, we could then do an interesting transition, and now the watch is really close, and we could get almost like the macro shot that we needed of the water dripping along the face of the watch and things like that. So we created first this animatic, which basically was a full built-out scene inside of Cinema 4D. And so this is a hardware preview. If you're not familiar with 3D or with Cinema 4D, this is essentially what it looks like inside your viewport in Cinema 4D. And it allows you to render it out much faster. You don't have to worry about lighting, texturing, or anything like that. So everything in here are basically like proxies, in the sense that they were just representing buildings back here or stairwells or things like that. And then once we figured out the timing, the transitions, and got approval on that, then we could go in and actually build the world out in its entirety, similar to what we did with the hero image that was the concept board that we saw originally. So let's watch the original animatic. This version, of course, does not have any music, but you'll see how we're zooming into the watch face. We see the tunnel that was inspired by the subway photo we saw earlier. You'll also notice that we're seeing different people that were placed in the animatic. One of the original ideas was to have a variety of different people moving throughout the scenes. And to be honest, we ran out of time. And the client didn't feel that it was necessary, and it may have actually taken away from the watch itself. So we ended up just cutting the people out, and I think it may have been stronger without them. But as you can see, this is figuring out the timing for everything. Everything's just blocked in. There's no details to any of the worlds, no textures, no look development or anything like that. So we got sign off on a hardware preview inside of Cinema 4D there. And then we begin building out actual beautiful rendered style boards for each world that we're going to be transitioning through. So then we present the client different style boards. You can see the subway tunnel down here, the watch falling. And that's one more thing to point out, is that we needed to show off all three colorways of the watch. So we have a light gray watch here, a dark, almost black watch over here, and then we have like an olive with an orange inside the subway there. So we were also accomplishing the three colorways as part of this video as well. So then once we have sign off on the look of it, then we can go in and kind of build out the worlds in their completion, spend a lot of time texturing and rendering them, lighting them. And so what we want to look at today is jumping into Cinema 4D and seeing how we used Cinema along with a third-party renderer called Redshift Renderer. So if you're not familiar with Redshift Renderer, let me jump into Cinema here, and we'll look at the scene, and I'm going to queue this back up. Redshift has a live render view that works inside of Cinema 4D. You'll notice that it currently says preparing scene. There are a lot of textures inside of this scene because it's an entire city block and every single building has its own textures, photos, reflectance channels, things like that. So you can see right now it's progressive rendering. One thing we'll do is, this is basically like the hero shot that we started the video on. What I'd like to show you is just a different perspective of the actual 3D world itself. So if we come out here and zoom out, you can start to see for this particular alley scene, all of the 3D elements that went into creating shot one. So you can see why that first animatic is really important, because you don't want to build out something this detailed and then have the timing cut, or you need half as much of that city block as you created. So that's where that animatic became key, is being able to know how much of this world are we going to see, how much are we going to fly through, and you can see that the Redshift render viewer caught up, and we can kind of get a different perspective of that little world that was created. So for every single transition that happened, we were creating kind of its own Cinema 4D file, fully built out and detailed, and then transitioning and piecing together some of these final renders inside of After Effects itself. So let's take a look at some of the techniques that were used inside of this scene. And we're also going to talk through Redshift as well. And one of the reasons we chose to go with Redshift on this particular project is that we really wanted to kind of push the limits, at least the limits for anything we had done with volumetric lighting. And so throughout the city, there are volumetric lights everywhere. Like all these buildings had volumetric lights popping out of windows, storefronts, things like that. We also had animated VDBs that we had created using Houdini, brought them inside of Cinema 4D, and then we had like steam coming out of manholes and things like that. So there were a ton of volumetrics, and Redshift handles those volumetrics really well and really quickly. So this is a very heavy scene, as mentioned before. So what I want to do is jump into a brand new project, and we're going to look at some different techniques here. So let's go into a brand new window, and here's what we're going to be talking about first. Let's pull up the hero shot. So let's take a look at how we used Cinema 4D to create the cracked ground. So let's do that, and then we'll jump into some texturing and light development for how this was created. So inside of this new document, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import or merge what is called a Redshift proxy. And if you're not familiar with Redshift proxies, it's very similar to an XREF. Let's see, file, merge. Oh, sorry, language barrier. Okay, so when I bring in the Redshift proxy, you'll notice that it shows up in my render viewer with kind of a default lighting there, and then in my my viewport inside of Cinema 4D, right now it's just a box. Well, Redshift gives you some options with the proxy. And so if I come over here to preview, I can go to mesh, and now I can see the watch in its entirety. And if the scene is getting really heavy and I don't want to be able to see the entire mesh, what I will do is I'll change the percentage. And so it's not great to look at, but if your viewport is slowing down, it will allow you to move around very quickly if you needed to do that. We should be okay to be able to keep it at 100%. So real quick about the Redshift proxies. Again, if you're not familiar with them, it was a seamless kind of export feature that allows you to keep the watch in a previous Cinema 4D file, and Redshift will pull the textures from that old file. So it won't fill this up. Like you saw in my original scene, and you may have noticed there were like tons and tons of textures from all the different buildings. The Redshift proxy will not bring in all those textures. It will reference the original image, and it'll actually process faster and render faster if you make proxies out of the things that you don't need to animate. So for instance, this watch being a proxy, you would not be able to go into the watch itself and animate the wristband to open and close. Inside of this scene, you would have to do it inside of the original Cinema 4D file and then export out a Redshift proxy. Now, one huge element that this kind of opened doors for us is the workflow between Houdini and Cinema 4D. What's really nice is Houdini uses Redshift, and so we've done some projects recently where there were some massive explosions, like millions of particles, and we were experimenting with like exporting out Alembic files, exporting out particle data, and trying to reconnect it, retexture it, and do things like that inside of Cinema 4D. And the viewport was getting very sluggish, and we were having issues. Well, we discovered recently that you can export out a Redshift proxy from Houdini, and then you open it up inside of Cinema 4D, and those millions of particles and the smashed bricks and all of those things moved around in the viewport and rendered no problem. So if you haven't been using Redshift proxies, or if you have any kind of Houdini workflow, that was really big for us to discover that, because we were going back and forth with like exporting out Alembic files and trying to rebuild everything, retexture it, and then there was just too much geometry to deal with, but it was much faster using the Redshift proxy in that way. So that's a little bit about Redshift proxies. Let's go ahead, and once again, we're going to be looking at how we created the cracked ground down here. So let's jump into that. I'm going to turn off my Redshift render view for now, and we're just going to focus on the cracked ground, and then we'll come back and do a little bit of look development. So as I get in here, I'm going to use this cube to create a ground, and I'm just kind of pulling and making it a random size right now. I will bring it down here. And then what I want to do is I want to go into MoGraph, and I want to go Voronoi fracture object, and you'll notice this is cracking my ground based off of like the rainbow colors that are here. If I go into the Voronoi fracture object, I can go into sources, point generator, and let's change this, say, to 120. So now you can see it increase the number of, say, like cracks and pieces that are in there. And let's go ahead and put some space between it so we can see what it's actually doing here. So now we have some space in between our cracks. One thing I want to point out is that you could use this geometry glue. And so you may be noticing that these different shapes and cracks are kind of all the same to a certain degree. But if you use what's called the glue cluster, based off of what this number is, I'm going to type in, say, 45. Now it's going to break it up, and the shapes are going to be a little bit more organic and a little less predictable. So that's one thing that's really nice about the geometry glue. If we use the geometry glue in conjunction with detailing, the scene starts to slow down a little bit. So I'm going to turn the geometry glue off, and then let's look at what enable detailing does. You'll notice now that it's actually gone in and it's made my cracks way more organic so that they're not just like completely straight. So super, super easy and fantastic way to create that cracked asphalt that we were looking at. But you'll also notice that the focus of the way this is broken up is kind of all evenly distributed. So if I go back into my Voronoi fracture object, and I go into my distribution type. If I type in normals, now you'll see what happens is all of the cracking, if I zoom out, is happening basically underneath my watch here. I may want to move my watch just slightly forward, and then as we get to the outside, it's not cracked nearly as much. So that's really nice and easy way to be able to crack the ground. I also want to point out that, and you can change the location of that. So you notice it just happens to be underneath my watch. But I could go into these coordinates and say I type in, say, let's try 1,000. And let's give it a second. I believe the detailing might be slowing it down a little bit. So what happened was I typed in 1,000 and it moved it completely off of the screen. So let's type in a smaller number, see if it makes a little more sense. So now you can see the cracks have moved off. So I enter in your coordinates and you can move it around where you want it. But for us and for this demonstration, 0 worked well. And let's see. That gives us our cracked ground. However, you'll notice it's completely flat. So let's solve for that. And again, if you're new and just joining us, we're looking at how we created this cracked ground, and right now we want to solve for how it's a little more organic and rotated and not just completely flat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into MoGraph, effector, and I'm just going to choose a random effector. And what that has done is that has scattered this around both vertically, horizontally, and on the Z. And so we can control that in our parameters. If I take the X to 0 and the Z to 0, so now it's only affecting our height. The problem with that is it's affecting the height absolutely everywhere. And I only want to affect the height and probably the rotation around the base of the watch itself. So let's go into fall off and choose a sphere. And you'll notice my sphere is very small right here. So I'm going to change the size of it. I'm going to go 600, 600, and 600. And then if we get a different angle here, you'll notice it's only affecting the height inside of the sphere, and everything outside of it is flat. And then we mentioned earlier we want to add a little bit of rotation to it. So let's try, I think we need to do it on the Y here. Let's try 15. So now we've got our rotation. Our height is probably too high. Let's just try 15. And then let's go in closer, get something similar to the hero image we were looking at. And so now we've got kind of like a nice organic looking cracked ground. And let's begin working on some look development for this. So first thing we want to do is we're going to open up the Redshift render view once again. Make sure we hit play, and we'll load this up. And so by default, there's some lighting in there. Let's not forget to add in a standard camera. And I'm just going to keyframe the position of it so that I can snap back to it quickly if I need to. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to go into Redshift and we want to drop in what's called a dome light. And in the dome light, by default, it's lighting everything completely white. And so we can go in and we can change that. If I go into the General tab and choose, say, blue, now it's illuminating everything to be a blue color. And it's illuminating it very evenly. So what I might do for a little more realistic lighting is I would drop in what's called an HDR image. And I'm going to use an HDR image from our friends over at Grayscale Gorilla. If you're not familiar with an HDR image, a lot of times what it is it's a 360-degree image that's captured with high dynamic range, and it allows you to load it inside of Cinema 4D and relight your scene realistically based off of maybe a 360-degree image you captured on set during a video production. And in theory, you can take that HDR image and light the entire scene using only that. A lot of times we will customize our lights though, because we want to be able to highlight the product exactly the way we want and art direct it. And so that's something we will look at as well, is being able to cast lights that hit just the watch and not the area around it. For now, what I want to show you, though, is that this HDR image is going to give us reflections. And so you'll be able to see whether it's in the glass. You'll notice that it's reflecting this large white image here. And if you see the thumbnail, our HDR has, probably some soft boxes and large lights that were captured in it. And again, our friends at Grayscale Gorilla created the HDR image, and they have an entire pack of HDR images that you can purchase off of them that make it very convenient to get really nice scenes for reflecting. You can also light it directly with this, as I mentioned before. So you'll notice if I crank the exposure, it's going to make everything really bright within the scene, or I can bring it down, and I could make it very dim. Typically, I'm using an HDR image as almost like a fill light rather than using it as the only light in my scene. And so many times you don't want to see that HDR image. You just want to use it for reflections in the glass or other types of reasons, like I mentioned, maybe a fill light, something like that. So the nice thing is you can turn it off, and you'll notice that the lighting and the reflections on the watch stayed exactly the same, but now you can do your own look development. You could load in your own image into the background and not have to rely on the HDR to be your background image. So now that we have just that dome light in there, what we want to do is explore some look development with the ground itself. And so let's take a look at the image one more time. And let's look at how we created a little more realistic asphalt texture. And you'll notice that within the asphalt, there are sections that are glossy and sections that are matte. And so we will look at how to control that and almost make it look like there are puddles across our asphalt. So that's what we will jump into now and look at texturing inside of Cinema using Redshift. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go to Object, Materials, New Material. And if you, let's see, I'm going to drag this material onto our Voronoi fracture object. By default, you'll see that that material is incredibly shiny. It's almost like a mirror or super shiny glass. And so we're going to look at loading first a photo of like asphalt or gravel into it to try and make this a little more realistic, and then we'll look at some of the reflectance channels as well. So in Redshift, it uses a node system. If you're like me, I've never used nodes up until about a year ago when we converted to Redshift. I was a little intimidated by nodes and didn't want to make that plunge. But in this industry, you're going to get left behind if you don't learn new things. And so it's always just kind of a challenge and a motivation to like force yourself to learn things. Learn new things. So what we want to do now is we want to look at some very basic node techniques that I think will kind of remove some of the intimidation behind nodes. So the first thing I want to do is I want to drop in what's called just a texture node. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to connect it into the diffuse channel, which is essentially like using full color. And so now that I have this RS texture, I want to choose a photograph. And I'm going to choose a photograph of asphalt. So when I load that photograph in, you'll see right now that photograph is in there, but our reflectance is completely unrealistic. It looks a little more like granite maybe, but there's still a lot of details missing from this that we need to add to it. So next thing we want to do is we want to go in and we want to add a texture into our reflectance channel. So I'm going to connect this node first. It is a brand new RS texture node, and I'm going to connect it to the reflection roughness. And so let's load in a black and white image. I'm going to load in something different. I'm not going to load in the exact same image. I'm going to choose this ground dirt. I'm literally just choosing something kind of random that has some grayscale values, because it's going to look at the white values, it's going to look at the black values, and it's going to decide what's going to be really glossy and what's going to be kind of matte based off of those black and white values. So if I load this into the texture, and then we allow Redshift to update, you'll notice we're already seeing some changes in our texture. So if I come over here, you'll notice we're starting to get some more realistic gloss, super reflective, and matte areas back and forth. This might not be exactly the control we want over the image. So the very nice thing that we can do is we can add in what's called a color correction node. And I come from a Adobe background, so a lot of the texturing I would do inside of Cinema was going back and forth between Photoshop and Cinema 4D. So in the past, something I may have done is just jump back into Photoshop, adjusted the levels on that grayscale image to give it more contrast, and then reloaded it inside of Cinema. Well, with this color correction node, I don't have to jump back into Photoshop. I can keep it all here and have just as much control. So I'm going to run my original texture through the color correction, and then it'll go into the reflection roughness. And so that way, when I come in, I have all these options of gamma, contrast, hue shift, saturation, and level scale. So you'll notice what happens. Let's bring this over here. If I change the gamma, now we're back to super reflective. If I bring it up here, there's just a little bit of reflection, and you'll notice over here it's got a little more gloss going on it. And then I can also adjust the contrast, and there's almost no contrast there. If I crank this up, now you're noticing I've got like some wet puddles in some areas like this. So let's adjust these. So that's looking pretty good right now. We're getting kind of that wet, looks like it rained about 10 minutes ago look to it. But you'll notice that our asphalt does not look very realistic yet because it's completely flat. And so what we want to be able to do is we want to add displacement to it. And again, if you're not familiar with displacement, essentially what displacement does is it looks at the black and white values similar to the reflectance, and it's going to make things higher or lower on your geometry based off of those black and white values. So if I add a displacement node, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the exact same photo of asphalt that we're using in our diffuse channel, except this time I'm going to put it in the texture map of our displacement. And then all I have to do is connect it to displacement here. And so these are some of the nodes that I'm using almost always. I should probably figure out a way to develop a script that every time I open Redshift, these nodes are just already there, because these are kind of the basic go-to ones that I'm using. Now, you'll notice nothing changed and we haven't displaced anything yet. So the reason for that is because we need to add what's called a Redshift displacement, or I should say a Redshift object tag. And then we go into that object tag, go into the geometry. We're going to turn on tessellation, and we're going to turn on displacement. And now when that catches up, you're seeing that it is reading the values of our asphalt, which was a black and white image to begin with, and it's now making it bumpy. So let me go ahead and exaggerate that if you're not able to see its results very well here. I'll change that to 4. And as I go to 4, you can see I'm getting a really big, thick displacement, which is nice. And then, of course, we can exaggerate that even more. Let's just try 34 so you can see the effects. And so now you can displace this and you can see all of this detail. Almost looks like grass. So you could potentially use displacement for grass if you didn't want to have to deal with hair or dynamics or anything like that. So that's basically how the displacement works. I'm going to go back and do, say, like 2 and 2. And so now we've got our asphalt pretty much dialed in. Let's take a look at our hero image one more time. So now what we want to do is we want to look at some lighting to finalize our look development. And so you'll notice in this hero shot, we have all of this volumetric lighting throughout the scene. If you're not familiar with what volumetric lighting is, it's basically like the haze that's created coming off of lights. If it's, say, a little bit of fog, atmosphere in the air. So you're going to get some really nice glows throughout the city. And so that was one thing that Redshift was fantastic at, was basically just cranking through all the volumetric lights throughout the entire city in the variety of like scenes that we were creating. So in the few minutes that we have left, let's just look at some basic lighting techniques and adding some of that fog and volumetrics to our scene. So what I might do is go in and use an area light. For me, I prefer working with area lights. They're typically the most photorealistic looking, and I'm just able to control them better. But there are a variety of lights that you can choose from inside of Redshift. Right now I've gone into 4 views. I'm in my top, front, right, and perspective view, and I've simply moved into this view so that I can do some 3-point lighting on this watch. So I'm just going to move it to the side here and get it at like a 90-degree angle. And then I'm going to just duplicate it by holding down Alt. I'm going to slide it over. And I'm keeping the lights for now just on the side of the product so I can get some really nice shadows and contours of the watch to stand out rather than putting like a harsh front light on it and flattening it all together. You'll notice that we're not seeing the effects of the light just yet. That's okay. We will solve for that here shortly. Let me drop in one more light. So rather than duplicating, I'm going to go just drop in a brand new one because it'll be at my 0 point. And then I will pull it up off screen. Whoops. Just going to get my placement in and my rotation, and then we'll start solving for why we don't see the effects. Okay, so I've got these lights placed, and right now we're not seeing much of the effects of it simply because we need to go into the intensity multiplier. So if I go into this light and I just crank it up to say 100, now you can see what's happening here and the results with it. So that I don't get confused, I'm just going to call this my left light. This one's going to be my right light, and then I'll make this one my top light. And so I'm going to go into my right light, and I'm going to crank this up to, say, 100. And now you can see that it's lighting it from both sides. And then let's go into the top light as well, and we'll just go with 100 for now. And I'm getting a top light as well, so that we can start to differentiate between the lights. What I might do is give one of the lights a little more warmth to it, and then might give another light a little more of a cool color to it, and that might help it to be a little more photorealistic. So I'll use the left light, make it warm. Right light, I will make it a little bit cooler. And then the top light, I'm going to go ahead and leave white. So obviously, if we're doing look development, we're not there. We're blowing everything out. This doesn't look great just yet. So what we'll do is we'll just go into the values and bring down, let's just try 50, see if that helps out a little bit. Probably still too bright, so maybe 20. Okay, so let's look at adding some volume to the scene, which will help us with our look development. So I'm going to go into Redshift, Objects, and I'm going to add what's called an environment. And so in the environment, there is this scattering, and the scattering is what allows us to have fog. But we need to go back into each light that we want to have fog on it, and we go into the volume. And if we add, say, 0.01, you can now see some fog coming from my left light. And I can increase that, and I'm blowing it out a ton. And so I've got some fog in my environment by adjusting the contribution scale here. Now, it might get a little messy if you start adding fog to every single light in your scene. So what I might do is keep the side lights at 0. And then only put fog on the top light. And that's going to help create a little more of a mood and an environment here. And let's just crank this up so we can talk about how to make the fog really thick. So let's go back into our Redshift environment. The nice thing about our Redshift environment is, let's say we had applied fog to all 3 lights. Well, we might not want to go into every single light and readjust the amount of fog that's on it, because that could be very time consuming, especially on, say, like the G-Shock project we were looking at. We would have to go into 30, 50, 100 lights in some of those scenes and adjust every single one. So the environment allows us to now go in and adjust how much fog would come out of every single light at one time just by doing it inside of the environment. So let's get this back to where we want it. Maybe like. So right now you can see it's very thick, maybe a little bit too thick. The nice thing is you have this attenuation. If we crank up the attenuation, let's exaggerate it. Essentially what it's doing, you'll see that there's not as much light hitting the watch anymore. And it's basically making the fog thicker. So I can increase the scattering at this time. And now you can see the fog is so thick that I don't even see the horizon line of my asphalt anymore. So the last thing I want to cover before we're out of time is the watch itself doesn't look good at this point. There's not enough light on it. But let's just say we're happy with the way the ground looks. Well, what we'll do is we will duplicate the left light. And let's go in and let's just crank this back up. Try to get some highlights on the watch. I don't want to spend too much time repositioning it. But you'll see with this particular light, we can crank it up to get those highlights. But now what we're doing is we're starting to blow out the ground below it or reveal way too much. So what we would do then is we could go into the light itself, go into the project, and then we would only include the watch itself. So now if I drag the watch into this, you'll see it's no longer blowing out the ground, and it's going to allow us to art direct the watch itself. So now we could go in and we could add in fill lights or lights for reflection, and we could have it only affect the product and get it to look exactly how we want it and art direct it better. So those are some of the techniques we're using on the G-Shock spot, as well as a variety of different projects that we're looking at. And so the last thing I want to do in order to close is show this video one more time, except now we're using hardware previews mixed with full res renders. So the hardware previews are out of Cinema 4D, and we're wiping the screen, showing the difference between the hardware previews and the final renders themselves. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for Maxon for having me out again.
Thank you, Barton. Are there any questions?
I was late, sorry. I was just wondering, could you take a look at the spot without the passes?
Yes. So we're going to take a look at the spot without the passes. Go.
Another question? No? Okay, then thank you again, Barton.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.